Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. Today my guest is Julie Michael. She grew up on both coasts and landed at the University of Arizona to study geography. During her time at the University of Arizona, she interned at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum with their education department. Today, Julie utilizes her understanding of physical geography and varied habitats to complement her knowledge of birds, as she interprets at the Patton Center for Hummingbirds, volunteers as a naturalist at Sabino Canyon, and leads field trips for various festivals here in Arizona. It's good to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.
With a background in geography, how does geography contribute to the wonderful bird diversity here in Tucson?
Well, geography speaks to a broad range of things. If we take the human element out of it, physical geography goes to the landforms and the plant diversity. Mm-hmm. In southern Arizona, we have, in effect, we call the Sky Islands, mm-hmm. which is about the mountains or surrounded by much lower elevation plants, and you end up with a huge range of habitats over those elevations. Okay. Such as here in Tucson, we're roughly 2,500 to 3,000 feet in elevation.
Yes.
Our immediate mountains, the Santa Catalinas, rise to a little over 9,000 feet.
Okay.
And in that are 3,000 to that top at Mount Lemmon. We're climbing over 6,000 feet. That's the equivalent of moving toward the North Pole, 2,000 miles. So we have plants up there that might be seen in Oregon.
Okay.
Or Washington, something like that. So the elevation changes contribute to our biodiversity. Mm-hmm. The canyons that have been cut by drainage over many years contribute to it. A west-facing canyon that's broad will get a lot of sun in the summer, and so they tend to be drier.
Yeah.
They tend to be more desert-like. The desert plants climb higher in those canyons. A north-facing canyon may never get sun in some spots, or if it does, it'll get it just at the middle of the day in the summer.
Yes.
And so those tend to be much more lush. Canyons such as Madera, well-known canyons, Madera Canyon, Huachuca Canyon. These are places of very complex biodiversity. You have maples, you have oaks, you have spruce and pine up at the higher levels of firs that you really don't get a whole lot of elsewhere. And they're further down into the canyon elevation-wise because they're more shaded. They're a little more protected. The land doesn't dry out as fast between rains. There are springs that keep a lot of that area lush. East-facing canyons like Ramsey and Miller and Carr are very productive as well because they'll get half a day. Cave Creek Canyon in Portal. So that's the landscape, the setup.
Yes.
Plants and animals are here because of what we described. And then you have the birds coming in, which in a sense have more choice. They don't have to. The plants are there. They're rooted. Either they live there or they don't. The birds could test a few things.
Yes.
And the birds choose these habitats that have that diversity. We have a lot of migrants that come just to be in our canyons. They aren't anywhere else in the United States. They're in our canyons.
Yeah.
So your elegant trogons, sulfur-bellied flycatchers, the dusky-capped flycatchers, there are many that come for that. Then we have birds that live with us year-round, that have found a way to work with what we've got here, our extreme temperatures, what seems like a sparse habitat out in the desert. And they are quite fascinating to me, how they survive, systems they've developed to survive, verdins, curve-billed thrashers, cactus wrens. There are desert birds, and they have really figured out how to do it. And they're actually doing better this year during drought than a lot of these migrants that come and are expecting ideal conditions.
Sure. So it sounds like some people may have a preconceived notion that Tucson is just desert, but we have this relatively close proximity of changes in elevation. So we have these high elevations, low elevations that grow different vegetation. So then it leads to some diversity in the vegetation in a relatively close proximity.
Correct.
And then we have these birds who come and partake in that and decide what they want to live in. They have the choice to choose one of these areas, and then they adapt accordingly.
Correct. The birds that are, the word isn't exactly flexible, but adaptable, are the ones who do the best. There are birds here who they only want to be in a particular type of tree, say a sycamore, an Arizona sycamore. And there are fewer and fewer sycamores around. So it gets tough for them to find appropriate habitat. Whereas a bird that says, anything with thorns is okay, they're going to do a lot better.
Sure.
There are some birds that are only the east side of the mountains. We have several mountain chains here to look on the east sides of. But they maybe only like a certain setup. And they are limiting themselves. And they may do fine, but they are also the birds that are more threatened by human development, drought, floods, fires, anything. Because if their area is destroyed or radically changed, they may not have a whole lot of other places to choose.
That makes sense. Shifting gears to birding, when did you first take an interest in birding?
I've been interested in nature all my life, but I grew up in a family of not outdoorsy people in the camper hiker sense. All my family, both sides of my family, garden.
Okay.
So go out, grow the vegetables, that kind of thing. So digging in the dirt seems natural to me. But there wasn't a whole lot of, let's go to the national park and take the botanical walk through the forest and figure out what we're looking at and everything. But I was always interested. My earliest memory of birds, other than this was when I lived in Pennsylvania, or like many people back there, robins on the lawn in the spring. Robins meant spring. My grandmother, who I would see once a year or so, she was disabled, and I always knew her that way. And she could get around to a point, but she needed to sit down frequently. So she liked to go to places where I could run around as a little kid, and she could sit and watch me. And she taught me to sit and just soak it in. We would call it mindfulness now. She just thought of it as a way of being. She would sit, and she loved cardinals. In Ohio, cardinals are definitely something that, they're a brightly colored bird. But back where it's so lush and green in the summer, they really jump out at you. They really stand out.
Yeah.
And she would decorate with them at Christmas. She would. So those are, just early things. But I credit her with my ability to just shut it all out and just listen to what's around me and be still and pay attention.
Yeah. I think with many birds, that's a great way to actually see or hear them, because sometimes when you're just walking through a particular place at a certain speed, you're going to pass right by, you won't notice it, but just pausing and just really,
Yes.
like you said, being mindful of what's around you. I think that's a great, I don't know if I would call it skill, but practice
Practice.
to begin at such a young age.
Yes. I find it with birding. There have been many times when I've been birding alone that I will hear a bird that I may not know at all or maybe don't know well. And I'll work to follow the sound and find the bird. And if I do, I'll stay with that for as long as it will let me.
Yeah.
And often if you're quiet and you're just standing still, the birds won't flush. They won't take off, and they'll just go about their business.
Yeah.
And you learn a lot by just observing what they're doing. They're very busy most of the time.
Yes.
And the life is all about finding those little tiny insects or seeds or whatever they're after.
Sure.
That's wonderful to observe.
Yes. I've noticed, especially here, there's a lot of verdins. And I've noticed that when I don't hear them as much, sometimes I'll identify where they are. And once I've got a visual, I'll just sit there, like you say, being still and watching. And they are quite busy. And I'll notice I could sit here for 10 minutes and not hear a sound. And I could think, had I walked by, I wouldn't have seen any of this. I would have known what this verdin was busy doing. And here, I managed to hear it at the right moment, pause, and I get to witness all that.
Yes, and birds like verdins are fun to watch. That's a local bird. They deserve a lot of attention from those who come to our area to visit, or folks who have just moved here. Maybe they don't want to be birders, full-time birders or anything, but they want to appreciate the Sonoran Desert. Verdins are a real treat, and they can teach us a fair amount as little tiny creatures who live here year-round, outdoors.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting what they do.
To manage throughout a whole year.
Exactly. And to do well. They're surviving quite well with humans. They're not declining in population in any significant way that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Speaking of other birds, you had countless encounters with birds. What is one, I know it might be hard to choose, that comes to mind where you just remember that particular encounter?
One of the many times I can think of that just really stick in my mind was early in my birding experience. I was a hiker and a camper, and I was in the mountains in Eastern California in the Sierras.
Okay.
I was interested in birds, but I really hadn't done much in the way of birding. And I went to one of the lakes out there, and I couldn't tell you which one, but I was walking down a pretty quiet gravel road, just walking along, looking at the sagebrush and enjoying the mountain scenery around me.
Yes.
And I saw this giant bird flying up the road like it was driving on the road. And it's coming right toward me. And I picked up my binoculars and realized it was a bald eagle.
Oh.
It saw me at some point in there and lifted. And it went up and it circled broadly over my head. And I looked up and I tried to take a picture of it.
Yeah.
And it was so hard, and I kept trying, and then it drifted away. And I said, "Oh, birdie, please come back." And it came back. and it flew over my head again, but closer down. And I got some pictures, and I'm not much of a photographer, but I thought, oh, wow, it listened. So I thanked it. I was very grateful. And that's one thing I do out there is I don't forget to be grateful for the experience of sharing nature. They didn't ask us to be here and change their lives. And they're trying to work with us. So I'm grateful that I get to share in their lives once in a while.
Yes.
So that's my memory.
That's a beautiful one. You had these encounters with various birds just like this bald eagle. What is the next bird you would like to see?
Well, I'm going later today, not to see probably, although visual would be lovely, but hopefully find and hear Buff-collared Nightjar.
Okay.
Possibly other night active birds. Common porwills are out there, possibly ferruginous pygmy owls, possibly elf owls. Don't know what all we might run into.
Sure.
But the buff-collared nightjar is our target.
Okay. And I'm assuming you've done a little research on how to find them.
I've been listening to them because that is how you typically find them, listening. They are a night feeding bird, typically early in the night.
Okay.
So maybe from just before total dark till about, say, midnight, maybe about 3 hours there.
Okay.
They're feeding on insects. And a lot of these night birds come out just after dark. The insects are still active and they're flying around the roads, the dirt roads.
Yes.
So that's typically when they feed. Then generally most of them are quiet from about midnight till, say, 4:30, about an hour before dawn.
Okay.
So roughly 4 this time of year. And then they'll have a shorter period of time that they might make noise in the morning.
Yes.
The morning noise is less predictable. The evening sound is more predictable.
Okay.
But I know that the buff-collared nightjars, they really, there's only a few each year north of the Mexican border.
Okay.
And they don't come very far into the United States. They prefer really remote desert canyons with some shrubs, some small trees. They are not typically ground roosters, so they need something of height to roost on. And there may be more out there than we ever find because we're not checking all these places.
Yes.
So the ones we know about this year are in 2 different locations. I'm going to a location that I have never thought of checking before. I didn't realize they were
there.
Possible there. So it's southwest of Tucson.
Okay.
And we're hopeful to hear them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that they usually feed at that beginning of the evening or right before dark. Seems like it would be difficult to feed on insects in a remote location with poor lighting. How are they adapting to that?
Well, they have large eyes and are well adapted to night vision. Insects, moths in particular, are very active in the evening.
Okay.
Actually, the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum has an excellent night pollinator garden and does offer programs in the summer tied to night activities in the desert. There's a lot of activities in desert adapted animals and plants even that have evolved because of a need to not exhaust their moisture supply during the day. So some plants, such as the columnar cacti, do not do their breathing. That's the human word for it.
Yeah.
But their vapor exchanges until night. They have pores that open up at night to release their oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. A lot of these birds sleeping during the day in the shade conserves energy, conserves body moisture. And then they come out just after dark. It's cooler. The moths are quite active during those first few hours. This is an area of birds I actually am learning more about.
Yeah.
I've always been kind of a morning person, so going out for these birds is a little different for me.
Yes.
But it's something new. I never get tired of learning something new in birding.
Yes. Yeah, that's why I asked that question. It seems just that whole realm of nighttime birds, aside from like an owl, I have no knowledge of that. So just hearing there's this whole different group of insects that are active at night that these birds will prey on. So when I typically see birds that hunt insects, I'm used to them looking for these particular insects. But at night, those insects are not roaming around. So these night birds are going after different insects. So like you said, it's something new to learn. And that's an area I have a lot of learning to do.
Yes, I do as well. I do know that there are, for example, most of the plants out there, native plants that flower white, that's an adaptation for night pollinators. White shows better by moonlight, by starlight, than, say, a dark red flower or something. And you think about bats, most bats are active just after dark during the night. And they are many are feeding on insects. Some are fruit feeders, some are pollen feeders, but many are locally feeding on insects.
When you're out birding in the daytime, outside of your phone, field guides, binoculars, what is something you never leave home without?
My hat.
Yes.
And I have several. If I'm not birding, I'm wearing sunglasses if I'm outside year round. I can't take bright light without that. And when I first started birding, I had been wearing prescription sunglasses and I had to switch around. I was wearing glasses and prescription sunglasses. And I figured out, well, I need to wear contacts. And it was too bright for me. I had to figure this out.
Sure.
Trial and error. But large brimmed hats became a staple for me. And it saves my skin. Yeah. Because I do burn. And if you're out there chasing a good bird, you don't think about reapplying sunscreen.
Yes.
So shade helps. So yeah, my hat's my friend. And year round, because our winter sun can do a number on you too.
Just as well, yes.
Yeah.
Outside of actual birding, what is something you do that is somewhat related that you enjoy, that's connected to the whole birding process for you?
Well, I had long before I was a birder, I was a hiker and a back road traveler and a national park nerd. I have my passport book that I stamp everywhere, and camping and that sort of thing. Part of what I enjoyed about doing those things is I love maps. That's what drew me to geography. I stay, when I'm home, when I can't be out there, I have my books and my maps, and I plan and I think about where I'm going. And that I've been doing that for many years. Well, now as a birder, I still do a lot of that stuff, but I'm wrapping the birds into it. So where are the birds? What birds like what habitat? Where do I need to go to find them?
Yeah.
Why have I never seen this particular type of bird? Oh, I've never gone out at night. Something like that.
Sure.
I have a bookcase full of maps and field guides and geology field guides and whatever. I mean, it's all about this kind of material. And so I do a lot of armchair traveling.
Yeah.
And then I actually go out and pursue some of that. But some of it, it could be years before I actually get to the place. And that doesn't change my enjoyment of it.
Yeah.
It's still, it's there. I'm learning about it.
Nice. On a much more basic level, I recently encountered the term range map. I had never seen that before getting into birding, but I found it very helpful, especially if you're visiting a new place, to have an idea of where birds might be. Well, I definitely didn't get down to the level of paying attention to the habitats and so on, but at least I knew that, hey, in this part of the state, you might see this bird. So if I saw that zip by, it's possible it was here because this is within range.
Correct.
I found that very helpful. So I guess that's been my first step into that area.
Yeah, people don't have to take it as far as I do. This is where my education is.
Yeah.
But understanding what birds might be in the area does help a lot to narrow down what you might see.
Yeah.
You know, people will come to me at the Patton Center where I volunteer, and I've had so many over the years. Oh, I just saw, you know, fill in the blank bird. And I'll think, probably not, because I know where that bird is normally found. I'll help them reframe what they were thinking about based on first, well, that would really be a great sighting for this location. And we get out a field guide, and a lot of times I can tell folks haven't ever looked at a field guide range map.
Yeah.
They say, oh, okay, well, if it wouldn't be that, then what could it be? So then we talk about field marks and things. And and sometimes we're able to get right to the bird that they saw.
Yeah.
And sometimes we leave it as a mystery. It's which is okay in birding. It's okay to say, I just don't know.
Because even if you don't know this time, you've picked up a couple new tips, and next time you see a similar bird, you might have a better chance at identifying it.
Yes. And if you've been introduced to a field guide, a range map, that sort of thing, you know what tools you could start with.
Yeah.
You know there are ways to figure this out. If you're unaware that those things even exist, as you said, what's a range map? Now you know that tool exists. If it's useful to you at a given time when you're traveling or something, then you know to reach for that tool.
Yes. Before we started recording, you had mentioned in the past you had some experience at a big box garden center.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about why we may not see some actual native plants there, or why it may be difficult to procure one there?
Sure. The big box garden centers big box stores in general are operated from a central location, headquarters.
Yes.
And then there's stores all over the country. Those stores throughout the country, though, are confined by the nature of the large purchasing power that comes with a big box operation.
Yes.
Advantage to big box operation, lower prices, larger purchasing power. So we like them as consumers because they can get us things for better prices.
Sure.
However, if you walk into your local nursery here attached to a big box store, you will be almost certainly buying plants that were grown in large-scale commercial nurseries, probably in this part of the country coming from California.
Okay.
Possibly coming from up around the Phoenix area, but almost certainly coming from California.
Okay.
The choice of plants is very rarely at all flexible for the local consumer. So if you walked in, say you want a prickly pear cactus, and they will take you over to some desert tolerant plants, some low water use plants, drought resistant plants. They might be labeled any of those ways. And prickly pear cactus does pretty well in a pot. And so you're going to be able to choose from maybe a couple varieties.
Yeah.
But you won't be able to find the 50 varieties that might be visible to you at a botanical gardens locally.
I see.
They're just not going to carry all of those. The things that they'll carry will be the most commercially adaptable varieties. And some plants that do very well here that are natives here, such as creosote or choyas. There's a big variety of choyas that are native here. Those are just not commercially viable on a large scale. They're not shipping them out from California.
Yeah.
It's not happening. So in general, locally, people aren't planting them.
Yeah.
Because most of us go for either what the builder put in our yard or what the landscape company hired by our HOA puts in our yard or what we buy at the big box store.
Yeah.
There are local nurseries, and there are nurseries that sell native plants, true native plants, grown in the Sonoran Desert.
Yeah.
When folks are interested in planting real varieties of plants that would be here naturally, that's your source. That's the place to go to learn about those plants and to purchase them. Places like the Sonoran Desert Museum, Tucson Botanical Gardens, and others, Tohono Chul Park, probably typically have semi-annual plant sales, and those plants may not look like much in a pot. They may look kind of like sticks.
Yeah.
It's part of why they can't be sold in big box stores. They'll never appeal to the mass public. Trust what they're telling you. Those are plants that will do well here. The loss of those plants in our urban habitats, suburban habitats here in Tucson, does definitely decrease certain animal and bird life here, because there are creatures that really want to nest in those plants and feed on those plants. And we have a white-winged dove hanging out nearby. I think it's nesting nearby.
Yes.
And sharing in our conversation.
Now let's move on to our bird segment.
Sure.
Where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. And for this episode, Julie has chosen the Curve-billed Thrasher. You just mentioned choya, and coincidentally, that is plant life that this particular bird you've chosen enjoys being around. Can you tell us where else we might find these curve-billed thrashers?
Well, curve-billed thrashers definitely favor choya as a nesting location. And it is why we don't have a lot of curve-billed thrashers in the urban Tucson area, although they're pretty well adapted to living around humans, much better than their cousins, their nearest cousins, Ben Dyer's, Chrysal, and LeConte's thrashers, which have chosen to stay pretty much outside of the urban areas.
Okay.
Curve-billed have decided, hey, the people are here, we're going to work with them.
Yeah.
But they their nesting areas, they nest typically from about, say, 2 to 5 feet off the ground. And right in the middle of the most tangly thing you can think of that looks inhospitable. If they can't go into the center of choya, which is their favored place. They will consider Spanish dagger is one plant. I believe Spanish dagger is a yucca. Plants are not my specialty, but spiky things.
Sure.
Sotol, another spiky sort of plant. They'll go into things that once in a while you'll see them, say, in the arm of a saguaro, but it would have to be a really low arm. They really don't want to go up too high.
Too high, okay.
They do turn up in the occasional low, tangly mesquite, like the wild mesquites that have not been groomed to be single trunk trees. They basically want to stay low. They are typically found on the ground. They run. A curve-billed thrasher is a bird that I actually would recognize and do recognize from a distance without really being able to see a lot of detail.
Yeah.
Roughly the size of a robin, if people know what a robin is sized like, but with a more slimmer, sleek look, very long tail, fairly long wings, dirt brown, for lack of a better description, dirt brown. Its breast is usually a little lighter, kind of a tan with some indistinct spotting, which varies in amount.
Yes.
It's not the best way to pick them out. And the adults have a yellow to orange, depends on the area, eye that really kind of jumps out at you.
Yes.
And a curved bill. And that bill can be relatively short to fairly long. When I say relatively short, the bill from tip to base is still usually at least as deep as the bird's head.
Okay.
From bill to back of head, if one is looking at it and trying to get a sense of how to judge that.
Yeah.
Whereas the ones with the longer bills, sometimes those curve out quite a ways and then downward. The downward curve that usually stands out to people, but it doesn't have to be dramatically down curved. A lot of folks here in the Sonoran Desert have heard them and not seen them. I'll do a really bad imitation. They say something like, "Wit wheat, wit wheat, wit wheat," and it's in the background, often around the end of the day, late in the afternoon. They'll scurry along the ground, and they'll stop if they decide, oh, that looks like a good place to eat. They'll stop and they'll poke in the ground with that curved bill.
Yes. They
They are looking for insects.
Okay.
They will also eat some small seeds and stuff, but the insects are their favorite thing. Around areas with, say, a sidewalk, and you might see this in your own yard, around garden stones or sidewalks, they'll poke right around the edges of them.
Yeah.
Clear out, you'll see this has been neatly edged all around, and the dirt is tossed to either side.
Yes.
And they're poking in there for insects and spitting out what they don't want.
Yeah.
They will go into leafy areas where there's fallen leaves.
Yeah.
And insects tend to hang out under the fallen leaves. And they'll take those leaves and they'll toss them back and forth with those big bills.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's where the name thrasher came from, that they're thrashing about in the leaves, or if that's just a good way to remember what they're called.
You talked a little bit about where they nest, where they eat. When you talk about nesting, about what size are their clutches?
Usually they can fledge 2 to 3 at a time. That's in a good year. They'll lay maybe 4 eggs. It depends on where they are. This is a thrasher that ranges in the United States from the desert in California all the way to the southern tip of Texas. Up into areas in the grasslands in eastern Colorado. So there's a broad range for this bird. In areas that rarely see freezes and tend to have plenty of moisture and food supply like southern Texas. They are more successful with, say, fledging 3 at a time.
I see.
But in times of scarcity or west of here in the drier desert, 1 to 2.
Okay.
Like many birds, clutch size versus how many they actually successfully get to adulthood varies a lot and is, predator dependent. The thrashers nesting in things like cholla, they're favoring cholla, wards off a lot of predators, you would reason, because the thorns are crisscrossed around there. However, lizards, snakes, those are probably the main predators. Get up in there and take eggs.
Yes.
And young birds, nestlings.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the thrasher does that is generally pretty successful for it is the first nesting's quite early in the season. So they'll start singing in the fall, late fall.
Okay.
What we think of as fall, November, December in there. And first nesting is often, say, January.
Okay.
If the offspring don't freeze, this is the early nesting is advantageous because reptiles are generally inactive at that time.
Yeah.
Reptiles aren't really active until the temperatures are staying above about 65. If you can have a successful nest when the temperatures are averaging around 55, you've succeeded in beating the odds on that.
Yeah.
And then you have the other things to worry about that might get in your way.
But you've avoided this class of predators.
Yeah, for that nesting time. Then they, like many birds, will go for a second clutch at a more traditional springtime, maybe March, April. And by this time of year, pretty much aren't singing anymore.
Yeah.
And probably won't be heard from until this fall again, other than the call note, the weet weet that people hear. And that is more of a location note between adults.
Communicating.
Can be female, can be male. The singing is much more involved, and that's territorial and mate attracting.
Yes. These smaller clutch sizes, might this explain why I don't see very many curve-billed thrashers together? I'm trying to think back if I've ever seen more than 2 near a certain area.
Probably. My best observation experiences have been at the Patton Center, where we keep brush piles.
Yes.
And in the winter, the curve-billed hang out in the brush piles. Possibly are nesting within the brush pile, although I have never noticed a curve-billed thrasher nest down there. But I've been there in the spring when they're bringing out the young and teaching them how to poke around for insects.
Yes.
So then it's quite possible to see 3 or 4 or 5 together. 2 adults and successful offspring.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that your experience with them makes sense. You may not see more than 1 adult with 1 offspring.
Yes.
They partner for life in terms of their lives. That could only be a couple years.
Yes.
If one dies, then they find another partner as quickly as possible. There's not a great mourning period or anything, but they share in some responsibilities of rearing young. And just my personal observations in a number of places, a lot of it involves because I'm seeing them in places where we have supplemental food and water out.
Yes.
my old backyard when I did have a regular yard, and places like Patton's. Seems to be adults bringing them in and teaching them, this is where you get this extra food. And hey, this is how you go to water. And they seem to do that. There's a fair amount of that sort of education.
Yeah.
And you can generally tell where that the young ones are kind of figuring it out.
Yeah.
They poke at things that are inanimate. Well, not inanimate, but not edible.
Yes.
And they don't know better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talk about the bill, we know that's a distinct feature of this bird.
Correct.
That curved bill. That curve allows it to dig a little bit to find these insects. Can you speak a little bit about how a bird's bill shape might indicate what they eat?
Sure. So, with the curve bill, like we were talking about, that curve helps it dig like picture something like a hoe, a little handheld hoe or something. It hooks down into the dirt, pulls back, and overturns some things. So they can do that with it. They can flip leaves over. They can probe with it. The curve can be good at all those things.
Yes.
It doesn't make it so they can't eat other sorts of things, so they will eat something like a seed. I've seen them carry larger things around till they figure out how to break them. And I had one very comical experience having put out some grapes that the thrashers do like fruit.
Yes.
And bird ran out and grabbed a grape and was quite proud of itself, ran off with this grape in its bill and went up on the roof and set the grape down. And the grape rolled down the roof. And it ran after it.
Yeah.
And it grabbed the grape and it went back up to the top of the roof. So this went on, as you can imagine, 3 or 4 times. And it finally picked up that grape and flew back down to a flat surface and reared back its head and stabbed down right into the middle of that grape and then opened the bill and split the grape in half and poked away and ate the grape. But it had to figure out first that it wasn't working on the roof. So, thrasher bills, they get in the way sometimes, but that's basically, it's evolved to be kind of an all-purpose bill, but a digging and overturning bill. Something like we were talking about verdins earlier. Verdin has a little conical bill.
Yes.
It eats small seeds, which it cracks with that cone-shaped bill. It eats little fruits, little insects, things it can glean off of a surface. We're all familiar with hummingbirds. They have the long, very slender bills, which have evolved, some quite spectacularly, to get deep into different shapes of flowers.
Yes.
So people will ask me, what kind of flowers should I plant to attract hummingbirds?
Yes.
Hummingbirds will fly up to any kind of flower, but the ones they will return to, because they found them successful sources, are the deep tubular shaped flowers, because the bill fits inside of that, and they're able then to lick out with their tongues or draw out with their tongues the nectar, the little insects that are in there. Hummingbirds eat a lot of insects, any of that. So hummingbird bills are pretty specialized.
Yeah.
There are birds like something like a hawk, or even a bird called a logger-headed shrike.
Oh, yes.
Or even the vireos
Yeah.
that have a hook on the end of the upper mandible. That hook is a tool for shredding flesh.
Yeah.
And they use that, and some of them have very exaggerated hooks. The vireo hook, or the is not especially pronounced, but it's there.
Yeah.
if one can see well enough in observation. It helps to get a good hook into, say, a caterpillar. Dig in. Picture like a can opener, an old-fashioned type that you're going to just poke into a tin can. That little bit of a hook gives you that thing that's biting in there, and then they pull back and open it up. So bills are very important when new birders are trying to get a sense of what's out there.
Yeah.
They often get attached to color.
Yes.
Because color is so natural for us to admire. And color's great.
Yeah.
But things like bill shape are very important to figuring that out.
Being out there looking at birds, if I see a bird I may not recognize, just by paying attention to some of these details in the bill, I can identify what their potential food source might be, and then in turn know where they might spend some of their time to get closer to that food source, and that could help me follow that bird or see more of them in the field without having looked at a book.
Sure. It's another part of it.
Yeah.
The understanding that is a part of the puzzle.
Yes.
Figuring out what's out there. If you're fortunate enough to live here in southern Arizona, there are birds to learn and appreciate and enjoy year-round. We rarely are snowed in and unable to see anything. And that's the best way to start learning, is to get yourself somewhere where you can watch. Don't try to absorb 20 species at a time. Try to pick up a handful.
Yeah.
Really look at them. Look at what's different about them. If they are roughly the same color, how are you going to tell them apart?
Yes.
They do different things. They maybe perch in a different position. They feed. One might feed on the ground. One might rarely, if ever, touch the ground.
Yeah.
The thrasher can fly just fine. Doesn't typically.
Yeah.
Typically is running around on the ground. Out in the desert where they might feel freer because nobody's out there.
Yeah.
And they'll roam around pretty easily from shrub to shrub, usually feeding under shrubs because that's where seeds have been dropped.
Yes.
And where seeds are, insects are. So it's a great place to eat. But they don't worry about being out in the open. Add a few humans, and you're more likely to see a thrasher running from bush to bush. And you'll see it run by quickly.
Yeah.
And you may not see its face. You may just see its tail.
So you couldn't see that yellow eye or that curved
Exactly.
bill. Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes thrashers can be quite challenging to differentiate when you're out somewhere that you have maybe read in the book. There are 3 different types of thrashers possible in a location, and all you're getting is a tail.
Yes.
The tail might get you down to 2, but it's probably not getting you to 1
All the way. Yeah.
on its own. You may have to see another part.
Yeah.
So that's, the bills, tails, behavior, all of these things are important to IDing before color.
Yes. Considering your background and considering your current volunteer opportunities, the things you choose to spend your time with, working with the public, helping people who are new to birding learn more about birds, we talked about off-air the idea of a wow moment. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Well, in environmental education, in environmental interpretation, as it's known, we learn to try to help people build an emotional connection with the environment, with nature. I may love birds, but you may not be particularly attracted to them. Maybe you really think those plants are cool,
Yes.
or something like that. Whatever the thing is out there in nature, in our Sonoran Desert environment. We want to help the public feel connected to it. And we go about that. One of the ways we go about that, doing that, is to share information while we're out there. But we're not just standing there giving a lecture, fact-based lecture.
Yes.
We want facts, of course, but it's more about encouraging people to see or hear or touch, if it's appropriate, with a plant or an animal. Maybe I'm holding a snake that I know can be touched by a visitor. I did some public interpretation with desert tortoises. There's appropriate ways to handle them and appropriate ways to avoid handling them.
Yes.
So the goal is to have you as the public feel a sense of ownership with the Sonoran Desert. We choose to make this our home, or maybe for many people I encounter in the winter, maybe it's their winter home. But we've chosen to be here, and we can tell that human activities here aren't always ideal for the future of the desert. And we want people to feel involved in that.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do out there is to find a way for you to see something and hear something, experience it, where you say, oh, I see that, or I get that, or I hear that, or now I understand that, whatever that is. And so that the next time you encounter it, you'll feel like that's familiar. Or maybe you'll see it in your yard and connect to it. Maybe you'll share it with a friend or a neighbor. The Sabino Canyon volunteer naturalists interpret for school children, school field trips. And often the children, depending on their backgrounds, don't have other experiences in the desert. They maybe have been taught that the desert is a scary place where things want to bite you and poke you and hurt you. Or maybe their parents just really have no frame of reference for it. Or possibly they don't have good transportation to get them to somewhere like Sabino Canyon, which isn't on a standard easy bus route or, not easy walking distance for a lot of people. We try very hard to engage those children out there. Kids these days can be so tuned out and so focused on their screens and everything. And what we're trying to get them to do is to be conscious, be aware, be mindful. Real quiet time mindfulness is tough with a group of children and a handful of chaperones and and a lot of chaos. But once in a while we get that moment.
Yeah.
And there are kids who you would not even guess had never been out there that just take to it. I had this one little boy who totally didn't look like he would be comfortable out there and was really just looked around a lot at first, and bug flew by him and he got very nervous. And we went on our nature walk, and he spotted things and pointed them out quickly. And he had an eye for small things. So he found us a horned lizard, which is colloquially known as a horny toad.
Okay.
They're very hard to see. They blend in perfectly. He spotted it.
Yeah.
And then he's telling me, and I finally did see it, but it took me a little bit. And he's trying to show his friends and his classmates and stuff. And half of them never did see the thing. And it was there the whole time. It froze in place and didn't move. But it blended in so well. And to him, it was obvious.
Yeah.
And he spotted something else, and he had the eye for it,
Yeah.
and yet had never seen any of this. And I'd like to think that he went home because most of the time we don't see the children again, the specific children.
Yeah.
But I'd like to think he went home and told his parents excitedly about it. And maybe they went out as a family and did something together. We always try to lead the kids along that idea that, you can do this. You can go out to these places, or you can go to the local park and see things.
Yeah.
Get excited about it. Adults can be different. Most of the adults that we see are, eager participants. They chose to
Be here.
take a walk, go to the Patton Center, go to the Sabino Canyon area. But sometimes they're just ride-alongs. My family brought me here or something.
Yes.
And sometimes it's hard to wow adults because they figure they've seen everything. It's all, there. If you can get them to relax with it and get into it, you can get more involved in explaining habitat issues, like not being able to plant cholla easily in the city. And so where are these birds nesting? And things like that you can discuss with an adult that is more than children necessarily will absorb. One of my personal goals with adults, other than to build that lifelong appreciation for nature, is to have them feel that sense of wonder that sometimes as adults is kind of hard. It can be difficult. And if they feel in awe and appreciate it, then if housing development is under discussion in a particular spot, and it is a poor spot from an environmental standpoint, from a habitat risk standpoint.
Yes.
If those adults in that area of concern have some sense of why we value these things, they're more likely to stand up and say, hey, isn't there somewhere else we could do this? Not anti-development, but how about we do it somewhere that's already been torn up and doesn't have natural vegetation on it anymore anyway.
To be upset.
Or something like that. And it can be as simple as getting people toward the idea of reusable plastic bottles or something.
Yes.
Or it can be as broad as, planting native species. And that discussion of, will it grow here versus does it naturally grow here? That can matter. The difference in there can matter significantly. And with adults, that's kind of what we're trying to build that relationship at all ages. But adults vote and adults purchase.
Yes.
And purchasing power and voting power and the ability to speak up or to make changes in their own yards and their own lives matters to the future of this fragile environment, and in related ways, of course, then to the birds that can live here and the other creatures that can live here.
Yeah. So when you encounter these people, if you could successfully create that wow moment, that sense of wonder, you could at least create some sense of appreciation, maybe even spur them on to a new hobby, and
absolutely,
best case scenario, create another advocate for environment.
Right. Or just maybe have them think twice before they plant something that doesn't really grow here naturally.
Yes.
And will take more water and more fuss, maybe some chemicals that we don't want to add
Yes.
in. Yes. And the other part of that, more specifically with birds, I have really enjoyed times where people come up to me at a totally unrelated place. I'm birding somewhere else. Say I'll be birding at Sweetwater, and somebody will come up and say, I was on your walk in Sabino Canyon a couple years ago, or I met you at the Patton Center, or I did this with you. And I have some people now who I've birded with independently or become friendly with over a couple years.
Yeah.
I have standing invitations to visit people in North Carolina and Minnesota and Iowa, people I know from
These trips.
leading them here. At some point, they signed up for something I was doing.
Sure.
It's nice. I get folks who say, oh, you taught me how to look at the bill
Yeah.
or how to, look at this, or they'll come to me and say, I know you aren't leading a walk right now, but could you help me figure this out?
Yes.
And I'm happy to. And they'll ask me about how to e-bird something because I do e-bird my bird walks, and they know it, but there's a finer point that they haven't figured out, and they'll come to me. And I like that they feel like I'm approachable. Even though I'm walking around alone, they know it's okay to interrupt me. And I rarely remember their names, but I almost always know their faces, where they were from.
Yes.
Maybe a special bird we saw that day. It's how I connect the people.
Yeah, yeah.
The names I'm hopeless about.
I've enjoyed the people I've met while birding. It's quite a community. It's a
It
welcoming
is.
community.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Julie Michael for joining us today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. While you're there, I would appreciate it if you left a rating or review to help more people discover this podcast. You can visit lookingatbirds.com for a transcript of the episode and pictures of the curved-billed thrasher and some of the other birds we talked about. Until next time, keep looking at birds.